So hi everybody, and welcome to Our Hydrogen Future by Adele Lidderdale, who works at Orkney Islands Council. And what we're going to do is have Adele speak for about 15-20 minutes and then have a Q&A session. What I would like you to do is pop your questions and your chat in the chat. So if you've got any kind of thoughts or you've got any questions, then just type it in and I'll look at that. And then after Adele has spoken, then I'll invite you to come on and ask your question if that works. If it doesn't work, then I'll just ask the questions. So without further ado, Adele, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Alison. I am Adele Lidderdale and I'm currently the Climate Change Project Officer with the Orkney Islands Council Local Authority. And prior to this role, I was the project manager for a number of hydrogen projects, and certainly the Orkney aspect of that, including the Big Hit project, High Seas 3, and some various kind of knowledge sharing projects that we have as well. So it's been a really interesting few years for that. Prior to that, I was a data technician with the European Marine Energy Centre, and my background is sustainable rural development. So how do we develop rural regions across the board, and energy and renewable energies in particular were a really great way for communities to improve their outlook and address some of the larger questions, which we'll go on to in a little bit more detail. So often what I get asked when we have visitors is, you know, why Orkney? We're at the very north end of Scotland, a small island, roughly 20,000 population. It just seems like quite an unusual place for a hub of energy activity. And really, this is kind of where we get into designing projects and addressing the specific issues, particularly around energy. And energy for us as a rural island in a cold place in the world is a very hot, no pun intended, topic for us to consider. So there's various strengths and weaknesses. So first we look at the weaknesses or the barriers, and that's really where the project development side comes in for energy and for many things. And then we look at the strengths. Where are we starting? Where are we able to kind of make a jump start on some of these projects or some of these issues that need to be addressed? Orkney has a great amount of grid curtailment. So we have a small interconnector from the Orkney Islands. I'll show you a map in a couple of slides time. And basically we are at capacity for as much electricity as we can have onto the grid. So in 2012, there was actually a moratorium on new wind connections over 4 kilowatts. So really, we had seen a lot of uptake of small-scale wind turbines, small-scale renewable developments, and the grid was at capacity. So we had an active network management scheme put in place by the grid operator, which is SSEN, Scottish and Southern Energy. And the wind turbines at the moment get switched on and switched off depending on where the weaknesses are in the grid and to manage that connection. So really the connection that we have for electricity was to bring electricity onto the island and distribute it. It wasn't designed in the first instance to be a transmission network. So that was one of our main issues. We have out-migration, like many rural areas, of kind of working age population. So the population in Orkney is fairly balanced, but it's aging more towards retirement age and above. We obviously have a large coastline, which is close to the water. So we have, many impacts from climate change. We have really high rates of fuel poverty on the islands as well. We pay a lot for our energy. So a lot of people think we get free green energy, but we don't. We pay a premium on that. It's a remote location. It's on the end of a cable. The population is fairly well dispersed, so you'll see that in a bit more detail in the map later on. And we're extremely heavily reliant on fossil fuels. So we have lots of ferries, we have everything coming onto the island via some mode of transport. And just for interest, to keep it topical amid the fuel issues that we're experiencing in the country, the prices at the moment at the pumps amid this kind of fuel shortage are still below what we would pay on a normal day for usual fuels such as petrol and diesel at that commercial end. So it's a really high cost, a high carbon cost, a high monetary cost. So, it's an issue that's worth addressing for us. And then some of the strengths are that we had assets available. We had some expertise in the companies that were here already. We've got a long line of mechanical engineering history. We have a long history of innovation. We have a lot of enterprising partnerships. A lot of the projects are delivered in conjunction with community groups, private partners, public partners, and the third sector as well. The local authority, where I sit just now, is on board with delivering these key projects, with addressing the energy issues. And then it's also just understanding that there is an issue to be addressed in the first place. So we have done a number of energy audits for the area. You have to excuse me, I'm just battling a cold just now. Sorry, excuse me for that. So this was done by OREF, the Orkney Renewable Energy Forum here, and it kind of outlines how the energy is used in the islands. It really gives us a direction. So you can see we have buildings, transport, marine transport, and industry applications there. Sorry, two tips. And we then get a sense of how that splits off. Hopefully that's the coughing now. So we have heat and light, we have transport and energy, and then you can see just how significant this transport area is for the island, and that makes sense. So we use things like still a lot of coal-based heating in people's homes, oil boilers, and there can be impacts for the islands as well when, policies are taken in place, particularly when lots of people are experiencing fuel poverty, and this is the cheapest way to heat homes. Most homes are heated with electricity. Then we have the aspects of things like insulation, thermal efficiencies, things like that. Road fuel, jet fuel, marine transport. You can see here, this is our huge usage of energy in that marine transport area. And these ferries, they carry populations to jobs, they carry the children to school, they carry goods, medical supplies, that's really is the lifeline link or the lifeline services. So the local authority in Orkney is unique in that it owns and operates the fleet of ferries within its usual transport remit, and there's around 13 ferries there, so that's a huge area that we're looking to decarbonise there. And it's tricky, there's no off-the-shelf solution. So that's really where we've been sitting in this kind of innovation space. But doing energy audits for the area like this is really important because it helps us understand that we're directing our resources into the right place. It helps us select relevant projects, helps us identify where the kind of pinch points are for the islands and what kind of areas that we should be tackling moving forward. So the previous energy audit was done in 2014. So we're carrying on that process and we're evaluating, are the interventions that we're doing with the projects having an impact on this overall energy landscape. So electricity, you can see that section. In Orkney, we generate in excess of 100% of our electricity requirements from renewable energy at the moment. So it's about 130%. So there's still quite a lot to do, but it's a good news story on that electricity side, and it shows that it's achievable as well, and that's slightly ahead of the Scottish mainland targets, and much well ahead of the UK target overall. So it just kind of indicates where we put the resources and challenges moving forward. And then often here, like the marine transport aspects, they're much harder to decarbonize using electricity, just because the energy demand of a ferry is just much larger. Plugging it into the grid, we have a few issues with initial onboarding loads and things like that, just given the grid capacity and things like that. So it's just building up this kind of knowledge and awareness of where those barriers are. And this is where things like hydrogen or hydrogen derivative fuels would come into play. And on the grid balancing side, which I think we've kind of seen play out live over the last few weeks across the country as well. So it gives you an idea of the number of projects. So the initial hydrogen project was the Surf and Turf project here in 2016. And I'll show you the map on the next slide and we'll talk through it a little more. Then the Big Hit project made the Surf and Turf project a little bit larger. So these two initial projects were using a community wind turbine in the period that it was switched off and curtailed to generate green hydrogen. So we use an electrolyzer. It's like the chemistry experiments that you did at school with the electrodes and the solutions. One side gives off oxygen and one side gives off hydrogen. It's pure form of hydrogen, so it can be used in fuel cells for things like vehicles and for heating. And then at the moment, the oxygen is vented to atmosphere. It doesn't have a greenhouse gas effect because oxygen is just controlled by temperature regulation there. And when the hydrogen is reutilized, we get H2O or water off the other side. So these two first projects were demonstrating the production of hydrogen using a wind turbine, and then starting to develop the demand side, the case, how would we use this hydrogen? And then all the in-between parts of producing it, storing it, transporting it, and all the kind of pieces that come in between. So that's where we start to see this wider supply chain, the needs for skills, for engineering skills, for gas handling skills. How does it tie in with safety considerations, not just HSE, but in terms of standards, in terms of familiarity. So we do workshops with the fire and police service here. They give us a lot of feedback. And it's all those sort of considerations when you're using a technology that you're not used to. Excuse me. So those projects are using hydrogen for a fleet of vans, for heating in a school, and then also to be reconverted back into electricity for some of the boats when we're sitting at the harbour. And then we see this continuation. Dual Ports was a European project and it's looking at decarbonising harbours and piers. We have ITEG, which is on the island of Ede, that's run by EMEC, and that's looking at introducing additional electrolysis, and again looking at grid balancing, excuse me, and introducing that marine aspect as well. Hydyne was looking at using hydrogen on board a ferry to run all the kind of additional systems. So not to propel the ferry on that project, but looking at how they power the lights, the galley, some of these kind of auxiliary systems, as we would call them. And that was looking at using hydrogen, not in a fuel cell, but in a normal combustion engine. So a normal engine that you would have on board a ferry or on board your car, you can actually combust hydrogen fairly easily there. So there's some comparison between which technology is going to be relevant for which project. And the benefits of that is that the upfront costs are a little bit lower when you look at internal combustion engine. And then you can do some converting of heavy machinery if it's in the middle of its lifespan. So say, for example, you've just purchased a ferry. It's quite a unique circumstance, but it might stand for bin lorries or buses or those things. It has a lifespan of 10 years, perhaps. With our ferries, they made it to the ripe old age of 30. It's not going to be cost effective to switch out that for a green option. So there may be some transitionary period in there where you can retrofit some of the technology. In our vans, we see they run on hydrogen and on an electric battery. So it gives you two choices of fuels, which is quite helpful. And it can extend the range. So it's looking at things like that. The High Seas 3 project, this is the one that was looking at a ground up, fully built ferry around a hydrogen propulsion system. So that would be using hydrogen technology to propel the ferry on its journeys and decarbonize there. And we saw from that previous slide how that's important for our area. And then moving forward more into today's kind of projects, looking at management of energy systems. So we talked about that network management scheme, how these different pieces of energy or how these different energy projects using electricity, using hydrogen or hydrogen derivative fuels potentially, how that all fits. Can we reduce how much energy is wasted, either through thermal efficiency improvements or simple trading algorithms and things like that? So it's starting to build this picture of how do we use energy, how can we use it more efficiently? And the Reflex project has really propelled the number of electric vehicles we have in Orkney. So we have hundreds of electric vehicle owners. We have a public transport system. It's really difficult in rural areas, and the public transport does things like tourist runs. It does things like school runs as well. So it's really difficult to rely on public transport. So this is where, you know, would EVs be great in rural areas, and we focus more on public transport in urbanized areas? You know, which pieces are going to be more prominent for which area? So we very much have that rural focus, but it's really about assessing your own area and seeing how the pieces fit together there. Excuse me. So I mentioned about aviation fuel. So there's now more than one aviation project in Orkney, both electric and hydrogen derivatives. And what I mean by that is ammonia, or you know, they're called, it was a colleague in Iceland who coined the term electrofuels to me when we were discussing. So, you know, different fuels that can be handled in different ways and have different properties as well. So in terms of the flights, you know, they've really opened up the ability for islanders to travel for work, for hospital appointments, for education. And not only do we fly from Orkney to mainland Scotland, but we have, you know, people living on the outer isles that need to travel to mainland Orkney for the same reasons. So obviously a flight is much shorter in time for people traveling as well. So it gives them that time efficiency. So we already see the next iteration of those high flyer projects around the 2020 timescale as well. We saw the publication of a few strategy documents. So I had the pleasure of drafting the Orkney Hydrogen Strategy document, which you can find on the Council's website. And then we have a few other things like the Sustainable Energy Strategy, and we have an electric vehicle strategy document. And it just brings together various partners, allows us to kind of reconsider where we are. These get re-evaluated every 5 years or so, sometimes sooner, sometimes a little bit later. And then just see, you know, are we on the right track? So it's that evaluation and monitoring. How's the policy changed? Where's energy in the agenda? How have the fuels developed? You know, so it allows us to really assess, but it also creates those conditions for private and public enterprises to really get behind these projects and drive some more of these projects forward. And then this year we have HyMet, which is an extension of the High Dime project, so taking that a little bit further. And then on the news just yesterday was the offshore wind and how that's going to be integrated into our energy system moving forward. And we don't know the answer to that yet, but it's all in consideration. So it gives you just an idea of how much time. So I was just looking at that. It's only 5 years, so it's done quite a lot in 5 years. But how the different projects play off each other, how they integrate, how maybe we see the first projects and areas we missed or things we need to pick up and address, and how they get carried forward into the next iteration of the projects and how they're addressing those different barriers, those different areas for consideration. And I think it's really important to show the map because we're not just one island lumped at the top of Scotland. So that's just 2 islands here. So this is the Orkney mainland here, and this is north, roughly north. My husband is actually from Shappensea. He went to school there, so it's quite a nice loop back into the community there. So the first project was actually Edie, so it's slightly further north. Their community wind turbine curtailed roughly at the time 50%, a bit less, bit more. We have the EMEC tidal turbine test site out there. So we had some substation facilities there already. We had a few energy production sites there already. You know, there's no homes or anything nearby, so it was quite a nice open space to trial these. So you can see that's how the building blocks. The community had an issue. They were losing their feed-in tariff from the wind turbine being switched off. We had a little bit of existing infrastructure, seemed like a logical place, and really the hydrogen was there to address that need to be able to take the energy away from the assets there. So that was the first project, the Surf and Turf project. And as you can see, we have to transport that hydrogen by sea back to the mainland, which is no easy feat. So we had to get exemptions from the Coast Guard Agency, the International Maritime Organization, lots of different groups there that had to be satisfied that we were demonstrating safety to the public, because these are public vessels. So what we ended up doing for that project was chartering some ferries to run just with the hydrogen kit on there. The hydrogen is transported. You can just see there's these tube trailers. You'll see that in a final slide as well. We have 5 tube trailers that can move between sites that carry 250 kilos of hydrogen each. So they go on the ferry, they can go on the roads in the Isles, and that's how we transport the hydrogen around. So the community in Shappensea, they had a similar issue. They had curtailment on their wind turbine. So another electrolyser was added there. In this first Surf and Turf project, the hydrogen was just used to be reconverted back to electricity. In the second project here, the Big Hit project, we were supporting. So we had 2 sites, which meant if anything was wrong with the first one, that we could have hydrogen produced from a second one. So you're starting to remove those sort of bottlenecks. And then we also had a hydrogen boiler on the Shappensea school. And it's really quite a nice story for Shappensea school because we had the innovative boiler system, the school was then able to apply for funding for thermal improvements to the fabric of the building. So they've seen their energy usage just dramatically drop since the Big Hit project there. And it's really nice for them to have a much more modernised building. And it's a community space. It's used by the NHS. It's used by various community groups as well when it's not in use for school. And also the vans. So the refuelling station was the large aspect of that. So we have a fleet of 5 hydrogen vans, 5 hydrogen electric vans by Symbio, and then a means to dispense that hydrogen there. So it's quite a neat system. And I think one of the really great things about the Big Hit project is that we were developing supply and demand at the same time. So if anybody's kind of used to working in the energy space, we get this chicken and egg scenario all the time. So it was nice that we were able to kind of create that system and that we were able to develop supply and demand at the same time. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. And then just in terms of funding, I mean, it's in the tens of millions of funding that Orkney's received from demonstrating these projects. Added value. So EMEC alone has added £306 million of value to the Orkney area. Jobs in the region of 70 or 80 jobs, not just in hydrogen, but in renewables across the board. So, you know, it's a significant employer, and there are still some, there's still a reliance on oil and gas jobs as well in Orkney. So it starts to address some of these kind of transitioning skills as well. But yeah, so a lot of public funding, some private funding, and just a big mixture of those different funding pots, community groups, etc. And that's just a kind of idea of the reflex system and how that works across all the areas. I'm aware that we're running to the end of time, so I'll just get to my summary slides now. Community buy-in. Really, we're addressing a local issue. It's globally relevant, it's locally relevant. We're just sure that we communicate that to the community as well, and that they're just part of it from the very beginning. The great thing about the project work is that certain community groups were able to join at the table as project partners, so they had an equal stake in the project, and I think that was really key to the success of onboarding those island communities. And they were addressing their own issues. It was from the bottom up in that, and just consistent with the messaging and communicating those benefits and tying that into the wider aims. And then just finally, the learning points, make it relevant, identify your stakeholders in the community as well as out with the community. They have an equal share. do your local assets audits. What's there? What are you starting? Don't have to start from zero usually. Include the use of, not in the use of people, include people in your audit. Who's got the skills? Are we addressing that kind of just transition with the jobs and things like that? So we often talk about the tech, the kilowatt hours, how are we going to get things on a ferry? Who's going to do that? What, we're doing this because it's people, it's human beings. So never lose sight of that. Just be aware of your strengths and weaknesses. And I think that one of the hugest benefits of the hydrogen projects was the story. People were ready to hear it across the world. It was the right time. Working in renewables, sometimes things can be too early, sometimes things can be too late. So just get out there and tell people what you're doing, and then just always tying it back to those benefits. And then, yeah, thank you very much for your time. And yeah, open to questions.
That was just fantastic, Adele, and I really love how it really is an island project. It's everybody's got a stake in it, and you're using what you have to the best that you can. It's all really integrated, and it ties into some of the other workshops really well too, about the whole concept of just having lots of different projects, and some will fail, and you learn from them, and you move on quickly, and you just got to keep on going. And that's how you can get the funding, and that you can share that knowledge and experience and with everybody, because everyone's on the same journey. So it's really great. Okay, looking at the questions I have, Douglas is asking, is it possible to get a copy of your presentation or further information?
Yeah, that's fine. I actually have an extra slide on the end that has some of the web resources on there, so I'm very much happy to share those. Yeah, you're at Highland Council, Douglas, so just feel free to get in touch with me. It's just adele.lidderdale with the usual council. It's on there. I don't mind being contacted. So yeah, just send that forward, and I made the slides so that they could be shared.
Fantastic. And Ian Kerr is asking, have you looked at the Norwegian work on electric ferries and direct power coupling?
Yeah, so we actually had quite a few Norwegian stakeholders over the many years come to Orkney and discuss their projects with us as well. We have a few learning networks, and it really is just looking at the northern periphery region. So we had a group that included Norway, Canada, some of the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, and those kind of countries, because we all share that kind of maritime aspect. We share port infrastructure, a lot of the same issues as well. Yeah, Norway's a really great example because they kind of they've done it in such a sustainable manner. They've really built their nest egg, and they've used that kind of funding and that kind of sustainable ethos to move forward. They still have a reliance on oil and gas as well, so they know they have some issues getting the community on board with particularly wind turbines. But yeah, they've been really inspirational and kind of taking that step forward, and really in addressing some of their heritage sites with their fjords and saying, we just won't accept, this carbon footprint coming into that area. And I think it's really bold moves like that help stimulate the change in policy and stimulate, the change for companies to, okay, we'll design a ferry that's electric, or we'll design a ferry that's hydrogen. And again, having those peer relationships with other areas, it kind of helps you know that you're on the right tracks. They'll use electricity where it's only a few miles span, or they'll look at hydrogen where they've got a kind of larger energy requirement. So yeah, we do work closely with universities and some private partners in Norway.
Right, I'm looking for more questions, but that gives me an opportunity to ask you some then, Adele. So, I mean, how easy was it to bring in commercial partners? I know that you work with EMEC very closely, but how did you find that relationship worked? And is there any more? Is it difficult to gain those commercial partners, or?
It depends. So actually, after we introduced the Orkney Hydrogen Strategy, we had people banging the door down to come and have a look. So those kind of documents are really important, and they get shown back to you all the time. It kind of just lets you say that, that we're open to a discussion. It just kind of came really naturally, but we're very proactive in that kind of. It's not, I don't want to call it networking because it sounds really, but it's just, reaching out to people, or people, welcoming in people to show them what we're doing. And then that's kind of where those relationships build from there. The biggest one to date was the Big Hit project. There was 13 different partners, around 50% of those were private. But, they have usually they have, you know, climate change as their aim, and that's their kind of ethos for their business. So it's always been a very collaborative way of working. So I think we've been quite lucky in that. And yeah, it's just, you know, you have a lot of talks behind the scenes, and not all of them work out. But it just seems to work out that, you know, the ones that kind of naturally meld together do in those projects, and then you're bound by the kind of aims and the overall agreements of the project, so you can have those common aims to work towards, which helps.
So you talked about the kind of community buy-in, how important that was, and obviously took the school example as well. And obviously there might be concerns about safety and all the rest of it. There's going to be a lot of kind of like, don't know if I like the idea. How did you really, like, at what stage did you bring in the community, and how did you deal with the community concerns, and how did you kind of work with the community to get positive buy-in?
Yeah, it's I think this is the one that can be quite tricky for engineers and things in a project, like, oh, nobody's going to like this. But, you know, there was a barrier there. There was an issue that needed to be addressed. The communities had their wind turbine, so they were kind of already used to that technology. We don't kind of see the same conversation around hydrogen that we sometimes see with onshore wind turbines. So we didn't really have that kind of hesitancy at all with the hydrogen kit, but obviously there are questions about safety and things like that. So we just made ourselves available. We went out into the communities, and I say it like I'm not a community member. I was keen, like, I am a community member also. Like, that's kind of one of the things that it's not just something that happens to you, that somebody from the outside is saying, right, let's do this. You know, it's kind of a mixture of ground up of this need to do something, and then supporting from, you know, European funding or Scottish government policy, or, you know, UK innovation money. So it's kind of that really good mix, but it's just being available to answer people's concerns, and that it's absolutely fine for people to have hesitations or concerns or to not know about things, because we all learn it at some point. So it's just being available and having answers to those questions, just making sure that, you know, and that way, you know, that you're prepared. And yeah, just there was always an open channel, and we were always sure to have events in the local communities on the islands, on the mainland of Scotland, as well as the ones from further afield. So it's just making yourself approachable, I think, is really important.
Yeah, it's having that kind of free flow, isn't it? Ian, you've got quite a lot of questions. Do you want to try and share your screen? So on the top right, on the black screen, as it were. Brilliant. This might work for one of the first times that we do this. Yay! Go, Ian.
Right. Yes. Because I've done some work in this area with subsea turbines, and a previous project of mine actually ended up in Scapa Flow being tested. So yes, I'm quite interested that you're having to shut down wind turbines because you've reached the capacity of the grid. Does that mean that the government is actually helping to put in some more interconnectors?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question for the interconnectors. Yeah, it just seems an unfathomable situation where you have this scarce resource, you're able to generate it, but for some reason you can't get into people's homes or where they need it. So with the interconnector at the moment, the situation is that the Ofgem require Orkney to demonstrate that there's a demand for the cable, and once that demand's satisfied, then they will be able to provide the needs case. Do we need that cable? But it's kind of this catch-22, because it's very difficult for developers to, you know, develop a project with no cable at the end. So I think where the hydrogen really fits in is it's not off-grid per such, because it could really work well being connected to the grid as well. So it just came about of that necessity of, like, well, the grid's not quite doing what we would like it to do. Where can we create some flexibility to carry on generating? So that's where the hydrogen has sort of fitted in until now. But I think what we've kind of seen develop over the last few months or so is that with the offshore wind and renewables projects, so like you were saying, there's still tidal projects as well. You know, a lot of those developers are having similar issues connecting to the grid once they hit land as well. So it's just the same issue, but obviously magnified, many orders of magnitude larger. So, you know, it's kind of, oh, well, what are we going to do about that grid connection. Hold on, there was this small project somewhere that did something similar. So I think, we'll start to see that mixture. And the way that I kind of analogize it, I don't think that's a word, using an analogy, we accept petrol and diesel together as a technology, and people will select the fuel that they want. So there's no reason why hydrogen and electricity or hydrogen derivatives and electricity wouldn't be treated in the same manner, and you just use the one that's relevant to your technology. So it's not all or nothing. But yeah, so I'm not sure the hydrogen directly supports the interconnector cable, but it does kind of show how you can work around some grid inflexibility, which is what we've seen with that interconnector issue.
Brilliant, John. Ian, sorry, I think you've got another question. Sorry, I muted you because I could hear some kind of feedback.
That's fine. Yeah. So what I've seen in other areas where we've put in the subsea turbines, like off the coast of Wales, is a change in the wildlife behaviour. And I wondered whether you'd seen done any monitoring up in Orkney on that, in that what they saw off the coast of Wales was, because the equipment was there, the illegal fishing didn't happen and the illegal dragging of the seabed didn't happen.
Yeah, I think less so for the hydrogen projects because they were all terrestrial, but I know that the environmental monitoring has been a huge part of EMEC's work, and there's quite a few good cetacean projects, and they had specific resource to monitor that. It's really interesting what you're saying about some kind of clandestine behaviours, being halted from the introduction of new technologies. And I think there's always this balance of users of a resource or of an area as well. So I think, we are kind of heavily regulated by the Crown Estate leasing guidelines and things like that, but there's always these conversations to be had with, some of our more traditional industries, such as fishing. We don't have many pelagic boats here and not so much dredging. A lot of that is done by hand diving and things like that, but it's not to say we don't have it, because we do. But then I think what we'll see coming forward in that marine space as well is, we've seen seagrass restoration projects, much more awareness around the importance of kelp forests and those kind of maritime ecosystems that people just don't see unless you dive or you're a snorkeler. So yeah, I think that's really important that those conversations are had. But EMEC, certainly from that marine aspect, they have a huge body of research around marine life and lots of things around biofouling and things like that. But yeah, that's all I have. It's not my area of expertise necessarily.
I think you did well. Any other questions from anybody? I think everyone's hungry. That's the issue.
Lunchtime.
And also, you did such a good presentation, Adele. It covered so much. It's fascinating, and to see how much you've actually done in, as you say, a 5-year period is astounding, and it just goes to show the ingenuity of the islands. And really, that's part of it as well, because when you live in quite a remote area, you have to be quite ingenious about what you actually do.
It's true. We can't just wait for the solution to be applied, because we end up with, the last thing at the end of a very long line of things. And I think we kind of seen that with COVID and Brexit as well. The shortages of supplies. We're just at the very end of the delivery chain. So by the time it gets there, there's nothing left. So I think we just have this, just because of how we've developed as a kind of region. We have a boundary, it's covered by sea. We don't really wait around for people to tell us what the solution is. If we want something, we kind of have to chase it a little bit, and it's just always been that kind of self-sufficiency aspect of being an islander and having kind of more traditional lifestyle till very, very, very recently. It wasn't till the zeros, the millennium really, that air transport was a thing that normal Orcadian population did. It was once or twice a week, and it was business trips alone, or the hospital if you had to go. So it's just, we've seen this explosion of a modern lifestyle. Not that we're backwards, we're obviously not with the energy side, but it's just coming from that, knowing that, it's not always that somebody's going to come and rescue you, that you just have to kind of get on with it and decide, for yourselves what's going to be the best. And I think we just kind of use that kind of innovative and self-sufficient mindset and apply it over onto these onto the energy issue.
Now, I'm conscious that quite a lot of your funding came from Europe, and I'm aware that quite a lot of the stuff, that good stuff, particularly in Scotland, has been from European funding, and obviously that's not a funding source that we can use anymore. How are you finding the kind of funding sources for new projects?
Yeah, it's definitely, the landscape has changed. So we still have access to EU funding, but probably not as a project developer, but as a partner. So there is some European funding there. I think some other industries which will touch on climate change moving forward will probably be more affected by that side. So we've seen a lot more funding coming from UKRI, which is the UK government's funding stream, and then Scottish government funding as well. I think from the makeup of the way things are going with the kind of industrialised strategy for climate change in the UK, there's going to be much more onus on the private sector to open their wallets a little bit there. So we'll just see how that plays out. But yeah, we're still very much in that transitionary period, but we still do have some access to European funding, and we've seen a lot more funding from the UK government.
That's good, and I think that the more things become commonplace, the more that they become more commercially viable to invest in, because the risk factor goes down. And usually when things are very risky, it's up to public sector, if they want to go along that direction, to actually fund them. So that's great. Right, we've come to the end of our workshop, which is fantastic, and I really enjoyed it. It's been a great presentation. It's always fascinating and really awe-inspiring how much that you're doing in relation to just building the renewable energy structure in Orkney. And if anyone has any questions, then they can get in contact with you. I've put your email into the chat. Just enable that to happen. But people can approach Adele on LinkedIn as well. And don't forget, we will be putting all the recordings up on our website by the end of next week. Well, thank you very much. Don't forget to come back for the panel in 15 minutes, and then that'll be the end of it. So hopefully you've enjoyed your morning. Thank you.
Thank you.